George Patterson. When I was a young man, only 23 years old, I joined the Communist Party. I was a member of the National Executive Committee of the American Young Communist League. In 1930, I was the official communist candidate for election to New York State Assembly. I knew Gus Hall and other top-ranking American communists very well because I trained with them at the Lenin University in Moscow. I joined the party because I honestly thought the communists were trying to help American Negroes. I broke away from the party when it became clear to me what the communists were really up to, was to use the Negro people in this country as cannon fodder in a violent and bloody revolution aimed at the establishment of the American Soviet dictatorship. It was that simple, and it is still that simple today. Make no mistake about it. What is happening in the United States right now under the banner of civil rights is exactly what has happened in China, in Cuba, in Algeria, and many other places around the world. When I was studying communist tactics and strategy in Moscow, my instructors emphasized the importance of using honest grievances and popular slogans as a smokescreen to cover up the true nature of the revolution. We were taught how to use propaganda and arouse the emotion of the masses. We learned how to set one group against the other and to make them hate each other. We learned the necessity of having martyrs, and we were even told how to create our own martyrs if they did not matter the result from the atmosphere of hatred. We were taught the importance of getting large masses of people into the street for marches and demonstrations. And finally, we were instructed in ways to take off riots and make them spread and to keep them going. When I returned to the United States, I was immediately given practical training. I participated in so-called nonviolent demonstrations that were deliberately calculated to irritate white people into violence against us. I personally was in charge of organizing a march on Washington to dramatize the Scottsboro Boys case. In New York, about 1935, a Negro boy was reported killed by the owner of a store while in the act of stealing some merchandise. Communist Party headquarters decided to make a march out of the boy. So we went right to work, putting out handbills and holding open air meetings. In less than a half hour after we started, there was a race riot on 125th Street, complete with smashing windows of white storekeepers, looting, and all the rest. I'm not speaking of things I read about. These are things I personally participated in.
I'm Julia Brown. For 9 years, I was a member of the Communist Party, serving as an undercover agent for the FBI. During that time, I learned that the communist conspiracy had been planning and working for years to bring violent revolution to America. It was to be a communist revolution, but the great majority of the American people would not be allowed to realize that until it had already happened. If all goes according to the communist blueprint, Americans will believe that the chaos and violence has something to do with civil rights. Our enemies were quick to find our weakest point for their attack. They knew that racial differences could provide them with an excellent wedge to divide our people. Their strategy simply has been to keep hammering on that wedge, to drive it deeper into our social structure, to open all wounds that have long since healed, and deliberately to create new ones wherever they can. Now, this doesn't mean that there isn't a legitimate need for the advancement of civil rights for many of our Negro citizens. Of course, there is a need there. Otherwise, communist agitators posing as civil rights leaders could never hope to enlist massive support for their schemes. The aspirations of Negroes for full equality were not created by communists, but they are used by communists in such a way that idealistic Americans of all races can be tricked into implementing the communist blueprint for revolution. Having been on the inside of the Communist Party, it's easy for me to recognize this revolutionary agitation in disguise. But the average American finds it's hard to believe that something as worthy and noble sounding as a civil rights movement could possibly be a communist maneuver.
Communism must be built with non-communist hands.
The revolutionary accepts reform in order to use it as a cover for his illegal work.
By concealing the true communist objectives behind appealing slogans and pretended humanitarian goals, the conspirators are able to dupe hundreds of uninformed opportunists and misguided idealists into supplying the non-communist hands needed in the overthrow of this republic.
We can and must write in a language which sows among the masses hate, revulsion, and scorn toward those who disagree with us.
Members and front organizations must continually embarrass, discredit, and degrade our critics. When obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic. Constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind.
By duping the American public into turning a deaf ear to the voices of warning because the topics were controversial or because the patriots themselves had been ridiculed as extremists, racists, fright peddlers, the conspirators were ready to move one step closer to their hidden goals by precipitating mob violence.
Riots, demonstrations, street battles, detachments of a revolutionary army. Such are the stages in the development of the popular uprising.
The Communist Party will educate and organize the working masses for mass strikes and mass demonstrations. It is through struggles that the working masses are prepared for the final conflict for power. As these strikes grow in number and intensity, they acquire political character through unavoidable collision and open combat with the capitalistic state. Mass action culminates in insurrection and civil war.
Paul also had charisma in the same sense that Martin Luther King had charisma. In other words, Paul was the kind of man that could lead masses of people. And those who understand those things knew that Paul Robeson was the man who could affect large majorities. Now, all this took place in an atmosphere superheated by the relationships between Russia and America at the time.
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Mr. Hoover speaks with authority on the subject.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government. There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia not the United States.
The reason that Robeson was a very strong supporter of the Soviet Union was it was his belief that they had no discrimination policies against blacks there or against anybody else. Well, he was treated like a prince whenever he came there. He didn't really know what was going on in the rest of the country. So his identification with the Soviet Union, whether he was an actual communist or not, was unimportant. He was theirs, and he supported them in policies both political and cultural, and made a big speech at one point that no black man and no black person in America would ever go to war against the Soviet Union, which sounded like he was calling for treason among the black population in the United States.
The state media made about blacks not fighting against their own interest was interpreted by a lot to mean that he was saying to us, you blacks can't fight. You shouldn't fight the Russians no matter what. Then the powers that be, meaning J. Edgar Hoover, had to cut down Paul's influence. And they set out to demolish the man, and they took some heavy bites out of him.
Baseball's top hitter and star second baseman of the Brooklyn Dodgers, Jackie Robinson, comes to bat for Uncle Sam to refute Paul Robeson's remark that U.S. Negroes would not fight in a war against Russia.
I'm on my way to Washington to testify before the House on Un-American Activities Committee. That's all I can say at this time. I'll make further statements from Washington.
Robinson is the last witness to testify concerning the loyalty of the members of his race. And before the committee, he reads his own prepared statement.
I've been asked to express my views on Paul Robeson's statement in Paris to the effect that American Negroes would refuse to fight in any war against Russia because we love Russia so much. I haven't any comment to make except that, on that statement, except that if Mr. Robeson actually made it, it sounds very silly to me. And most Negroes and Italians and Irish and Jews and Swedes and Slavs and other Americans would act just as all these groups did in the last war. They'd do their best to keep their country out of war. If unsuccessful, they'd do their best to help their country win the war against Russia or any other enemy that threatened us.
So this then raises the question of his attitude towards the communist movement, because the communist movement and Lenin and these kinds of people, they are talking about the anti-colonial struggles. And it's part of the sort of the grand picture of how that movement saw the world. But I don't know, I'm not so sure what in terms of the American movement and how real that was in the American movement, and especially in terms of how so much of the leadership of some of the unions, at least, were in fact quite racist. And then the Communist Party here, I mean, they certainly did advocate unions that were multiracial, but I don't know how that worked in practice. So what was his relationship? Because just quickly at the end, when he's like 93 years old, he joins the Communist Party.
Exactly. Well, you know, you had, after World War I, this upsurge of leftist activism. And you had leftists in the African-American community, Cyril Briggs, A. Philip Randolph, and others. And many of them supported the Russian Revolution. Du Bois hesitates. Claude McKay, the poet, is very outspoken in his support. But then Du Bois has an opportunity in 1926 to visit the Soviet Union. And he writes this famous article that appears in the Pittsburgh Courier, an African-American newspaper, where he says that if what I've seen is Bolshevism, then I am a Bolshevik.
Hold it right there. Why is Angela Davis a communist?
Actually, I think I answered that before when we were talking about what a revolutionary is.
Many times the term communist, because I think it's been used by so many different aspects of our society to put down rather than to let people try to understand. You know, everybody shuns away from it. It's like it's a disease or something like that. And I just, you know, what I'm trying to get through is that the brother here in that letter is raising a question, and therefore in his question it seems that he's trying to say that there are some people who are plagued by that, and they let that get in the way. They don't want to know Angela Davis as a person, or even if they do, that prevents them from coming to know Angela Davis as a person.
Well, you see, now that might be true for say the vast majority of white people.
Yeah.
But one of the things which really impressed me when I was on the streets and fighting for my job at UCLA was that whenever I spoke to black people, whenever I spoke in the black community, very few people had hang-ups about communism. I can remember many times walking down the street and having someone stop me and say, are you Angela Davis? And I would say yes, and they would express their solidarity and say, a lot of sisters and brothers would say, even though I don't really know what communism is all about, just as the brother here said, they say, we know that there must be something good about it, because otherwise the man wouldn't be coming down on you so hard.